How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the House of Horror, and as much as I love modern horror films, there's just something about the silent era that's just so fascinating to me. The lack of sound only enhances the atmosphere and makes it feel like you're not even watching a film, but rather experiencing something real, like an ancient artifact that you just unearthed, a time capsule from a period we're so disconnected with. And the fact that most of them are period pieces, it makes them seem even older than they actually are. I honestly love silent cinema, and I don't think audiences today appreciate them the way that they should, or have even seen any of them. I don't know if it's just from lack of interest or what, but I feel as if these films need more exposure. And hopefully if you haven't seen some of these films before, you consider checking them out. Truthfully, we're lucky that most of these silent films even still exist, and I feel that there's a lot we can learn from them. It truly makes you appreciate how far the horror genre has come since the advent of sound films. Today we're going to be looking at 10 of the very best silent films, in my opinion. There are plenty to choose from, but these are the essentials. They are the most entertaining, innovative, and ultimately scariest silent films ever made. Without further ado, here are my top 10 silent horror films. Number 10. The Hands of Warlock, 1924. Paul Orlock is an accomplished and world-renowned pianist. When he's involved in a horrific railway accident, he loses his hands and they're replaced with that of a recently executed murderer. As soon as he realizes this, intense feelings of terror overcome him, and he grows a desire to kill. When he discovers that his father's been murdered, Orlock is convinced that the blood is on his hands, literally. Are Orlock's hands possessed? Is he just losing his mind? Or both? Although not as highly regarded as most other films on the list, it has its place in horror history. It's been remade twice, first in 1935 entitled Mad Love, and again in 1960 with Dracula himself, Christopher Lee. It's also inspired countless other hand horror films, and although it probably isn't true, I'd love to think that there's some ties to Evil Dead 2. So go ahead and put your hands together for the Hands of Warlock. Number 9. The Fall of the House of Usher, 1928. There were actually different Fall of the House of Usher films that came out in the same year, but we're talking about the French adaptation. This version of the classic Edgar Allan Poe story is both beautifully surreal and incredibly haunting. It takes some creative liberties when it comes to the plot, such as the incest being removed for good reason. The production design and cinematography are also extremely elaborate and creative for the time. So much that it was one of the key influences on Orson Welles when he was directing Citizen Kane. Coming out in 1928, this was the last great horror film on our list to be released. This was right before the birth of sound horror films, or talkies as they would have been called back then. And the collapsing of the House of Usher itself can symbolize the end of silent cinema at its greatest peak. Number 8. L'Inferno, 1911. This is actually the very first Italian feature film ever made, and the oldest surviving horror film. Its age alone adds to the creepiness. There's not much to say in terms of the story. It's basically just a tour through hell, where we see our main character Dante meet a plethora of sinners and witness the eternal punishments that they must endure. The film is loosely based off the divine comedy Dantes Inferno, if you haven't figured that out already. It does lack a firm narrative structure, which keeps it from maybe ranking higher on our list, but it's still incredibly entertaining, atmospheric, and with it being so historically significant, it makes it a must-watch. Number 7. Faust, 1926. God and Satan are in a constant struggle over control of the earth. Instead of the score, they wager over Faust, a prayerful and well-educated alchemist. If Faust's righteous soul can be corrupted, then evil will triumph over good, and Satan's reign of terror will control humanity. It's a classic story, which has been passed down in German folklore for generations upon generations. This adaptation brings plenty of creepy imagery brought to life by some impressive special effects. It wasn't the first adaptation of Faust in film. There were a couple short film versions, one of which is now lost, and there was a French adaptation from 1922. But this version is the most well-known and the best. It was directed by F.W. Murnau, and it's one of his very best. But remember, I said one of. Number 6. The Golem, 1920. The Golem is a classic fixture of Jewish folklore. Our story begins with a rabbi sculpting the golem by hand and summoning the ancient god Astaroth to inhabit the golem's body in order to protect the people of Prague from the Roman Empire. And for a while, this plan works, but then due to the planet's alignment or some shit, the golem goes apeshit and rebels. It's actually the third film in a horror trilogy, but it's a prequel, so it leads many people to believe that it's the first in the series or just a standalone film. The first two films are lost, however, so you can't see them anyway. This was a key influencer in the style known as German Expressionism, and it has a lasting impact on horror cinema. Number 5. The Phantom Carriage, 1921. The Phantom Carriage is considered one of the best and most important films in all of Swedish cinema. Based off the novel Thy Soul Shall Bear Witness, The Phantom Carriage proposes the notion that the last person to die on New Year's Eve is stricken with a terrible curse. As such, he must take the reins of the Phantom Carriage and carry out Death's duty of collecting souls for the next calendar year. The film is equally heavy on drama as it is with horror. There are some obvious similarities to A Christmas Carol, with spirits showing our main character visions of his past, and the fact that it takes place on a winter holiday. It has sensational special effects, especially for the silent era. The film has a vast lasting legacy and was a major influence on The Seventh Seal, and it's even referenced in The Shining. This is a fairly underrated film as far as silent classics go, and I feel that this deserves much more attention. Number 4. Hexon, Witchcraft Through the Ages, 1922. This one has always been one of my personal favorites. This film is part documentary and part anthology film full of witches, devils, and demons. It's probably the most gruesome film on the list, especially with its depictions of medieval torture devices. The special effects are amazing for its time, and we can see some genuinely creepy imagery. The film actually has 2 different versions, one of which actually includes a voiceover narration, so it's technically only sort of half a silent film. The only major drawback is that neither version is perfect. Both have their pros and cons. The silent one tends to drag because of the heavy use of title cards, particularly during the documentary portions. In the sound version, the narration does make these sections much more entertaining and brings the total runtime down by about a half hour. But it also features this goofy jazz score, which doesn't fit the tone of the film at all. So pick your poison, I guess. I wish someone would make a fan edit that includes the voiceover for the documentary portion and keeps the original score for the vignettes. No matter which version you choose, you're in for a spooky good time. So grab your cauldron and check it out. Number 3. Phantom of the Opera, 1925. Inside the Paris Opera House lives the shadowy cloaked figure known only as the Phantom. Upon falling in love with a young understudy, he lures her deep into the catacombs, where he is exposed as the disfigured and insane former composer who he truly is. What can I even say? The look of the Phantom is simply iconic and is one of the most recognizable movie monsters of all time. Lon Chaney, known in the horror business as the Man of a Thousand Faces, is not only magnificent in the role, but also did all of his own makeup and created the look of the Phantom. This is one of, if not the most famous silent film of all time. It's been remade for the silver screen countless times, has been adapted into a Broadway musical, and has even had that musical version brought to the screen as well. Even with the many different interpretations, this one is still the best and stands the test of time. It does have a few goofy moments, like when the Phantom goes under the water with that stick hanging out of its mouth. But the iconic imagery and Lon Chaney's powerhouse performance make this version of the story absolutely quintessential. Number 2. Nosferatu, 1922. I've already talked about this film enough in my 15 Phenomenal Facts video a couple years back, so I'm going to try to keep this brief. Nosferatu is the oldest surviving adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula novel. It follows the basic plot of the story, although it does deviate quite a bit. Most notably changing the names of some of the characters. Count Dracula is now Count Warlock, and completely changing the ending, subsequently affecting vampire lore forever. These deviations weren't just creative choices, but they were made out of necessity by the aforementioned director F.W. Murnau. Due to the film being unable to acquire the rights from Bram Stoker's widow, the film was produced illegally and was almost completely lost when the court ordered that all known copies of the film be destroyed. But like Dracula himself, the film could never really die. When it comes to silent horror, it doesn't get much more classic than this. Even if you haven't seen the film before, I guarantee you've at least heard of Nosferatu from the famous SpongeBob episode. Nosferatu! I love this film, perhaps more than any other silent film. Not just because it's a great film, but because of how it impacted vampire mythology. Its influence has been seen in nearly every vampire story that followed it, whether they're aware of it or not. Now you may be asking yourself, the Phantom came in 3rd and Nosferatu is only number 2? Well, let's get to our top pick, the best silent film ever made. Number 1. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, 1920. It may not be as popular as Phantom of the Opera or Nosferatu, but The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is the very best of the bunch. It's the most creepy, atmospheric, and has the most complex story out of any film on the list. It's based on an old 11th century myth that deals with a monk who has a strange sort of influence over a man in his keep. In this case, Dr. Caligari has control over the sleepwalker Caesar and commands him to commit crimes and murder. It's considered by some critics to be the very first art movie, since it's impossible to discuss it without mentioning its extraordinary German expressionist production design. This style perfectly complements its tale of murder and madness, as well as the deliberately cryptic and abstract storytelling. It's told from the perspective of an inmate in an insane asylum, so the German expressionist production design is actually more than just a creative choice. It's how this individual who has gone completely mad sees the world, with warped architecture, surreal shadows, and everything feels just like a distorted dream world. It gives a truly nightmarish ambiance and genuinely gives you a chilling feeling. The film was also very innovative, as it was one of the first, if not the first, film with a twist ending. It also helped popularize the trope of a monster falling in love with the leading lady. Its lasting legacy has inspired the works of Tim Burton and countless other films that rely heavily on a dreamlike gothic style. It truly is, in my opinion, the greatest silent film of all time. Well, that is about it this time, guys. I hope you enjoyed my top 10 silent films. Of course, these were just silent feature films from the silent era. I didn't get into any of the amazing short films out there. And there were a lot of films that have some spooky influences but aren't a horror film throughout. So I kind of had to draw the line somewhere, so these are the ones that just I picked. These are my personal preferences. And of course, these are all from the silent era. These aren't any modern films trying to emulate that style. This is the real deal. If you guys enjoyed this video, please make sure that you subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications so you know when new episodes of the House of Horror come out. And if you were to give this video a thumbs up and share it with a friend, it would really help me out a lot. It really helps this channel. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video. I'm sure there were a ton of subconscious Cinemassacre references in there, because that's how I was introduced to a lot of these films. So when I'm writing a script, those words just kind of pop in my head. I don't even think about it. So yeah, I'll leave some links down below to some of the videos that provided inspiration for this. And I will see you guys next time on another episode of the House of Horror. Take care and stay spooky.